October 24th, 1942, 23 hours. The jungle breathed. That's what John Basilone thought in those final moments before the silence shattered, that the darkness itself was alive, inhaling and exhaling with a rhythm that matched the hammering in his chest. The air hung thick with moisture, wrapping around every Marine on Lunga Ridge like a wet blanket soaked in the smell of rotting vegetation, gun oil, and the metallic tang of fear sweat. Basilone ran his fingers along the feed tray of his Browning M 1917, checking the ammunition belt for the third time in 10 minutes. The metal was slick with condensation. Behind him, Henderson Field's single runway stretched into blackness, and he knew, the way a man knows something in his bones, that if the Japanese broke through tonight, everything they'd bled for on this God-forsaken island would be lost. He was 26 years old. His hands, calloused from a decade of working-class life before the Marines, boxing matches in smoky bars, laying asphalt on New Jersey roads. Anything to escape the poverty of Raritan, now rested on a weapon that would either save his position or become his coffin. The Browning EM 1917 water-cooled machine gun could fire 400 to 600 rounds per minute when properly maintained. Basilone had 2 of them positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the narrow approach to their section of the perimeter. On paper, it was textbook defensive positioning. In the suffocating dark of Guadalcanal's jungle, it felt like trying to hold back the ocean with a garden hose. Private First Class Anthony de Fiore shifted his weight beside the second gun, and Basilone heard the young man's breathing, quick, shallow, the kind of breathing that comes before panic or glory. De Fiore was 19. Back in Brooklyn, he'd been saving up to marry a girl named Rosa who worked at her father's bakery. Basilone knew this because soldiers told you these things when they thought they might die. They told you about bread fresh from the oven at dawn, about the way sunlight looked through tenement windows, about all the ordinary beautiful things they might never see again. Sarge? De Fiore's whisper cut through the jungle sounds, the insects, the distant calls of night birds that weren't birds at all but Japanese scouts communicating in the darkness. "Stay on the gun, Anthony." Basilone's voice was steady, though his stomach churned. "When it starts, it won't stop. Not for hours." The intelligence reports had been clear, though clear was a relative term when it came to information gathered from native scouts, intercepted radio transmissions, and the testimony of half-dead Japanese prisoners. The 29th Infantry Regiment, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 men, was moving through the jungle toward the American lines. Their objective, Henderson Field. The tiny airstrip had become the most valuable piece of real estate in the South Pacific. From Henderson, American aircraft could strike Japanese supply convoys, could protect Allied shipping lanes, could turn the tide of a war that, in October of 1942, still seemed impossibly balanced between victory and catastrophic defeat. Basilone had been on Guadalcanal for 53 days, long enough to watch dysentery turn strong men into shaking skeletons, long enough to see what malaria did, the fever dreams. The bone-deep chills, even in 100-degree heat, the way a man's eyes went yellow before he went back to the field hospital for good. Long enough to understand that the real enemy wasn't just the Japanese soldiers who came screaming out of the jungle with bayonets fixed. The real enemy was the island itself, ancient and indifferent, slowly digesting every man who fought across its green hell. He'd grown up Catholic. 9 children in a family where every meal was divided 9 ways, where his father Giovanni, an immigrant tailor, had worked his fingers bloody to keep them fed. The Marines had seemed like an escape from the Depression's grinding poverty. But it was also something else, a kind of redemption, a place where a man could prove he was more than his circumstances. Now, crouched in the mud with his hands on a machine gun that weighed 41 pounds without water, 93 pounds with its tripod mount, Basilone wondered if he'd been looking for this all along, this moment where everything stripped away except the fundamental question, would he hold or would he break? The first scream came at 23:17 hours. Banzai. The sound erupted from the jungle like something torn from the earth's core. Not one voice, but hundreds, thousands, a wall of human fury that shattered the night. Basilone's hands moved before his mind caught up, chambering the first round, settling his shoulder into the weapon stock, his right hand gripping the spade grip, his left feeding the ammunition belt. They came in waves. That's the detail that would stay with every Marine who survived that night. The waves. Japanese soldiers emerged from the tree line in massed formations, bayonets gleaming in the sporadic moonlight that broke through the jungle canopy. They ran with the kind of courage that comes from absolute conviction, from a culture that had told them surrender was worse than death, that their emperor was divine, that the Americans were soft, weak, unprepared for men willing to die with honor. Basilone opened fire. The Browning's roar was deafening, a mechanical thunder that drowned out everything. The screams, the explosions of grenades, the crack of rifle fire from the positions to his left and right. The gun bucked against its mount, the barrel recoiling in its copper, cooling jacket as water circulated through to keep the metal from melting. Tracers cut through the darkness, every fifth round glowing phosphorescent green as it arced toward the advancing Japanese. Basilone fired in controlled bursts, 6 to 9 rounds, pause, 6 to 9 rounds, conserving ammunition while maintaining maximum effectiveness. The first wave broke against the American positions like surf against rocks. Bodies fell, silhouettes dropping in the muzzle flash, but more came behind them. Always more. The Japanese 29th Infantry had been told this was the decisive battle, that breaking through here would change the course of the war in the Pacific. They believed it. They fought like men who believed it. Basilone's world contracted to the space between his eyes and the gun sight. Load, fire, adjust, fire. The brass casings ejected hot, raining down around his boots, collecting in piles that grew ankle-deep, knee-deep. The smell was overwhelming. Cordite, burning metal, the copper penny stench of blood, and underneath it all, the sweet rot smell of men dying in the tropical heat. Private de Fiore kept his gun firing in concert with Basilone's, creating the crossfire pattern they'd drilled for weeks. The two Brownings swept the killing zone methodically, traversing left to right to left, denying the Japanese any covered approach. But the enemy had numbers. For every 10 men who fell, 20 more pressed forward. They came with mortars, with grenades, with a ferocity born of desperation and doctrine. At midnight, the barrel of Basilone's gun began to glow. First a dull red, visible only in the darkness between muzzle flashes. Then brighter, cherry red, then orange, then a white-hot incandescence that hurt to look at directly. The water in the cooling jacket had begun to boil, steam hissing from the valve ports. Basilone kept firing. His hands blistered where they touched the barrel shroud. The pain was distant, unimportant. What mattered was the gun. What mattered was keeping the gun firing. To his right, he heard someone scream, not in fear, but in agony. He risked a glance. A Japanese grenade had landed in the position manned by Corporal Ralph de Groot and Private John Powers. Both men were down, Powers not moving, de Groot trying to crawl toward his rifle with his left leg shredded. The Japanese, sensing weakness, surged toward the gap in the line. Basilone spun his gun, tracer rounds cutting through the darkness toward the breach. He walked the fire across the advancing soldiers, dropping them 3 at a time, 5 at a time, the Browning's mechanism cycling so fast it sounded like ripping canvas. But even as he fired, he knew they couldn't hold if the ammunition ran out. The belt feeding his gun ran empty at 0030 hours. He'd fired over 2,000 rounds. The barrel was so hot the cooling jacket had begun to warp. The ammunition cans beside his position, each holding 250 rounds of .30 caliber bullets, were empty. Every single one. He grabbed for another can, found nothing. To his left, de Fiore's gun went silent 30 seconds later. The young Marine looked at Basilone, his eyes white in the darkness, and said just 2 words. "We're dry." For a moment that stretched into something eternal. Basilone heard everything. The Japanese regrouping in the jungle. the wounded Marines groaning in the mud, the crackle of fires burning where mortars had struck, his own heart pounding so hard he thought his chest might crack. And beneath it all, the breathing of the island, that terrible, patient breathing of a place that had seen civilizations rise and fall long before Americans and Japanese decided to kill each other across its valleys. He made his decision in the space between heartbeats. "Keep them off me for 5 minutes," he told De Fiore. "Use your rifle. Use rocks if you have to." Then Sergeant John Basilone did something that, by every tactical consideration, every military manual, every rational calculation of risk versus reward, he should not have survived. He lifted the Browning off its mount, 41 pounds of red-hot metal. The barrel seared his palms instantly, the skin bubbling and blackening where it touched the superheated steel. He didn't scream. There wasn't time for screaming. He cradled the gun against his chest, feeling his uniform begin to smoke where the metal pressed against it, and ran into the darkness. The ammunition depot was 600 yards to the rear, up a muddy trail that wound through the jungle. Under normal circumstances, with a full working party and proper lighting, it was a 10-minute walk. These were not normal circumstances. The jungle between Basilone's position and the depot was alive with Japanese soldiers, infiltrators who'd slipped past the main American line, scouts probing for weaknesses, wounded men crawling through the undergrowth looking for somewhere to die. He moved through them like a ghost, not quietly. There was no quiet with 41 pounds of machine gun and 60 pounds of ammunition cans strapped to his back. But he moved with the kind of desperate purpose that sometimes looks like courage and sometimes looks like insanity, and is usually both. When a Japanese soldier materialized from the shadows, Basilone swung the barrel of the Browning like a club, the hot metal crushing bone, and kept moving. When he heard voices calling in Japanese, he circled around them, his boots squelching in mud that might have been mud, or might have been something else, something red and terrible. The burns on his hands went from pain to numbness. That was worse somehow, the numbness. It meant nerve endings dying. It meant damage that might not heal. But his hands kept gripping the gun, and his legs kept moving. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where a man keeps the things he doesn't want to examine too closely, Basilone understood that he'd crossed a threshold. There would be a before this night and an after this night, and the John Basilone who'd grown up in Raritan, New Jersey, who'd boxed for beer money and dreamed of simple happiness, was dying just as surely as the skin on his palms. He reached the ammunition depot at 0047 hours. The supply sergeant, a career Marine named Walsh, who'd been in since before Basilone was born, took one look at him and started loading cans without questions. 6 cans of .30 ammunition, each weighing 15 pounds. 3 belts draped across Basilone's shoulders. Walsh tried to take the machine gun to give Basilone's hands a rest, but Basilone shook his head. He'd carried it this far. He'd carry it back. "You need a corpsman, Sergeant. I need ammunition." Basilone's voice came out like grinding gravel. "My boys are holding with empty rifles." Walsh grabbed 2 more cans. "Then let's not keep them waiting." They made it halfway back before the Japanese found them. A patrol, 6 men, moving through the jungle with the confidence of soldiers who believed they were behind enemy lines. They saw Basilone and Walsh in the same instant that Basilone saw them. For a moment everyone froze, each side processing the impossibility of the encounter. Then training took over. Basilone dropped the ammunition cans, shouldered the Browning, still hot enough to see in the darkness, and fired from the hip. No mount, no tripod, just 93 pounds of weapon braced against his hip, the barrel spewing fire and lead into the night. The recoil nearly knocked him down, but he kept his feet, kept firing, walked the burst across the Japanese patrol in a sweeping arc that dropped all 6 men in less than 5 seconds. The silence after was absolute. Walsh stared at him. "Jesus Christ, Manila John. What are you?" Basilone didn't answer. Couldn't answer. He picked up the ammunition cans and started walking. Behind him, Walsh grabbed the rest and followed, because sometimes the only response to the impossible is to keep moving. They reached the Marine line at 01:15 hours. The Japanese attack had intensified. Grenades were landing inside the American positions now, close enough that Basilone could feel the concussion waves against his chest. Di Fiore had fallen back to the second defensive line with 3 other Marines, trying to hold with nothing but rifles and bayonets against an enemy that seemed endless. Basilone set down the ammunition, mounted his gun, and loaded a fresh belt. Then he killed the mechanism. The Browning had been fired continuously for over 2 hours, had been carried 600 yards while still hot enough to melt skin, had been fired again without proper mounting, and now Basilone asked it to do the impossible. Keep firing. The weapon was beyond its operational limits, beyond what any machine was designed to endure. But Basilone had grown up fixing cars with his father, had learned that machines, like men, could be coaxed past their breaking points if you understood them deeply enough, loved them completely enough. He fired. The gun held. The second wave of ammunition didn't last long. 20 minutes, perhaps 30. Time had become elastic, meaningless. What mattered was the next belt, the next target, the next moment of holding the line. Japanese bodies were stacking up in front of the American positions now, actual piles of dead that the living had to climb over to advance. The attack should have broken. By every reasonable military calculation, the Japanese 29th Infantry should have recognized the futility, should have withdrawn to regroup. They didn't. They came again and again. Waves of men who believed that willpower could overcome machine guns, that spirit could defeat steel, that dying with honor was better than living with shame. Basilone killed them, not with joy, not with hatred, but with the mechanical precision of a man doing a job that needed doing. His mind went somewhere else during those hours, a place of pure function, pure purpose, where there was no pain, no fear, no past or future. Just the gun and the target and the next belt of ammunition. At 03:30 hours, he made his second run to the depot. This time, 2 Marines went with him, Di Fiore and a kid from Ohio named Mitchell, who couldn't have been more than 18. They moved faster, knowing the route, knowing which shadows to avoid. But the journey was harder somehow. Basilone's hands had gone from numb to a deep, bone-level agony that made gripping the gun an act of will. His uniform was stuck to his chest where the barrel had burned through the fabric and into his skin. Every breath hurt. They loaded up at the depot. More ammunition, more weight. Walsh had tears in his eyes when he handed over the cans, and Basilone understood, not because Walsh was weak, but because bearing witness to something like this, being unable to do anything but supply it, was its own kind of hell. On the way back, they found Corporal de Groot. He'd crawled almost 200 yards from where the grenade had shredded his leg, leaving a trail of blood that looked black in the darkness. He was still alive, barely trying to reach the aid station. Di Fiore and Mitchell wanted to carry him, but de Groot waved them off. "Get the ammunition to the line," he whispered. "That's what matters." So they left him there. Because he was right. Because in war, sometimes the arithmetic is brutal and simple. 1 life versus 100. 1 man's suffering versus the collapse of an entire position. They left him there, and Basilone added it to the weight he was carrying. Not the physical weight of guns and ammunition, but the other weight, the kind that doesn't show up on any scale. They reached the line at 0400 hours. Dawn was still 2 hours away, but Basilone could feel it coming, some animal awareness of the earth turning, of the sun approaching from beyond the curve of the world. The Japanese must have felt it too, because the attacks intensified. They knew what American air support could do in daylight. They knew their window was closing. Basilone mounted his gun for what he thought might be the last time. His hands were ruined, blistered, burned. Some fingers bent at angles that weren't right, but they still worked. That was the miracle and the curse. They still worked. He loaded the belt, chambered the first round, and settled into the firing position that had become as natural as breathing. The Japanese 29th Infantry came one more time. This was different from the earlier waves. This wasn't tactical maneuvering or probing attacks. This was everything. Every remaining soldier, every reserve unit, every wounded man who could still walk, all committed to one final push. They came in a human flood, screaming, firing, dying, and still coming. Basilone fired into them until the barrel glowed white-hot, until the cooling jacket split and water gushed out, until the mechanism itself began to seize from the heat. And still the gun fired. Beside him, De Fiore's weapon jammed. The young Marine worked frantically to clear it, fingers shaking, but the mechanism was fouled. Basilone never broke rhythm, just shifted his fire to cover De Fiore's sector, traversing the gun through an arc that should have required two weapons. His hands were leaving blood on the spade grips. His chest was a mass of burns. But the gun kept firing and the Japanese kept falling, and somewhere in that eternal moment, Basilone transcended pain, transcended fear, transcended even himself. He became the gun, not metaphorically. In that moment, Sergeant John Basilone ceased to be a man with hopes and dreams and memories of New Jersey summers. He became an extension of the Browning M1917, a biological component in a killing machine, as impersonal and relentless as the weapon itself. It was the only way to survive, to stop being human, to stop feeling, to stop understanding what he was doing to the men in his sights. At 05:45 hours, the jungle fell silent. Not gradually, not with a winding down of gunfire and screams. Just silence, as sudden and complete as if someone had thrown a switch. Basilone kept his finger on the trigger for another 30 seconds, sweeping the killing zone, but nothing moved. Nothing lived. Before his position, in an area roughly 60 yards wide and 100 yards deep, approximately 900 Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying. 900. He'd killed most of them himself. Not all. De Fiore and the other gunners had done their part, and rifle fire from the supporting positions had taken a toll, but the vast majority had fallen to Basilone's gun, to his hands, to his refusal to let the mechanism fail. The number was incomprehensible, too large for any human mind to process in terms of individual lives, individual stories, individual mothers who would receive telegrams they couldn't read through their tears. So Basilone didn't process it. He released the trigger, his fingers leaving bloody prints on the metal, and simply sat down in the mud. De Fiore was crying. Mitchell had vomited and was dry heaving into the underbrush. Other Marines were emerging from their positions, walking among the dead, with the stunned expressions of men who'd survived something that should have killed them. Someone was calling for Corman. Someone else was calling for Basilone, asking if he was alive. He didn't answer. His hands had finally stopped working, the fingers locked in the shape of the spade grips, and when he tried to open them, the pain that flooded in was so intense that his vision went white. He looked down and saw his palms, blackened, blistered, meat exposed where the skin had burned away completely. They didn't look like hands anymore. They looked like something from an anatomy textbook, like something that should be buried. "Sergeant Basilone, you need medical attention." It was Lieutenant Griesmer, the platoon commander, standing over him with an expression that mixed horror and awe. "That's an order." "My gun needs cleaning," Basilone said. His voice came out strange, distant, like someone else was speaking through his mouth. "Your gun can wait. You're going to the aid station." 2 corpsmen arrived, but when they tried to help him stand, Basilone shook his head. He reached for the Browning with his ruined hands, needing to break it down, to clean it, to maintain the weapon that had saved him, saved them all. But his fingers wouldn't grip, wouldn't work. And in that moment, looking at his useless hands, Sergeant John Basilone understood what he'd traded for survival. Not just his skin, not just his health, but some fundamental part of his humanity. They carried him to the aid station at 0620 hours as the sun rose over Guadalcanal. The light was beautiful, golden and pure, filtering through the jungle canopy and shafts that illuminated the Carnage like some terrible cathedral. Around Lunga Ridge, Marines were counting bodies, collecting dog tags, beginning the grim mathematics of after-action reports. The Japanese 29th Infantry Regiment had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Henderson Field was secure. The price was written in blood and burns in the hollow eyes of men who'd seen too much. The mathematics of heroism. The field hospital on Guadalcanal was a collection of tents and mud, where the line between life and death was determined by triage protocols that would haunt the doctors who implemented them for the rest of their lives. When they brought Basilone in, he was categorized as walking wounded, conscious, coherent, not bleeding from major arteries. By the normal protocols of military medicine in 1942, he should have waited. There were men with sucking chest wounds, men missing limbs, men whose chances of survival diminished with every passing minute. But one of the doctors, a Navy lieutenant commander named Richard Sorensen, who'd practiced internal medicine in Boston before the war, took one look at Basilone's hands and made a decision that violated every standard operating procedure. Get him on the table, now. The orderlies hesitated. There was a Marine 3 beds over who was bleeding out from shrapnel wounds to his abdomen. There was a protocol. There was a system. I said now. Sorensen grabbed Basilone's wrist, careful to avoid the burned areas, and pulled him toward the operating tent. Do you know who this is? This is the man who held the line. If we lose him to infection because we made him wait, every Marine on this island will wonder if we gave a damn. It wasn't medical logic. It was something else, a recognition that some lives carry weight beyond their individual existence, that heroism creates obligations, that the man who saves hundreds has earned the right to be saved himself. Sorensen knew it was unfair, knew it was undemocratic, knew it violated the principle that all lives are equal. He also knew it was true. They operated on Basilone while he was still conscious. There wasn't enough morphine to waste on someone who wasn't going to die in the next hour, so they gave him a leather strap to bite down on and poured sulfa powder directly onto the exposed meat of his palms. Basilone didn't scream, didn't even whimper. He just stared at the tent ceiling while Sorensen and his team debrided the burns, removing dead tissue, checking for signs of infection that would require amputation. Can you feel this? Sorensen touched Basilone's right thumb with a scalpel. Yes. This? Yes. Good. That's good. Sorensen worked quickly, his hands steady despite the conditions. Sergeant, I'm going to be straight with you. These burns are severe. 3rd degree in several areas. The next 72 hours will determine whether we can save full function. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Basilone understood. He understood that he might never grip a machine gun again, might never box, might never do any of the physical things that had defined his existence. But what he said was, "Will I be able to return to my unit?" Sorensen paused in his work, looked at Basilone's face, and saw something there that made him deeply sad. "You're going home, Sergeant. You're done here. I didn't ask what you think should happen. I asked if I'll be able to return to my unit, not for months, maybe longer. These need time to heal, physical therapy, probably multiple follow-up surgeries." Sorensen resumed debriding the wounds. "But honestly, after what you did last night, you've earned the right to go home. Let someone else do the fighting." Basilone closed his eyes. Home. The word felt foreign, like something from a different language. Home was Raritan, New Jersey, was a house full of siblings, and the smell of his mother's cooking, was streets where people knew his name and cared about ordinary things like baseball scores and whether old man Carlucci's tomatoes were coming in good this year. That world seemed impossibly distant, separated from this tent, not by miles, but by an unbridgeable chasm of experience. He'd held the line, killed hundreds, burned his hands to blackened claws. And for what? So he could go home to people who would call him a hero without understanding what the word really meant? So he could sit in living rooms and tell sanitized stories about courage and sacrifice, while the real memories, the smell of burning flesh, the sound of men screaming in Japanese as they died, the way it felt to become a killing machine, stayed locked in a place he could never share? "Sergeant?" Sorensen was watching him. "You're in shock. That's normal. Once we get these bandaged and get some fluids in you, you'll feel better." Basilone didn't argue. There was no point. How do you explain to a doctor from Boston that you can't feel better, that better assumes a return to a previous state, and that previous state doesn't exist anymore? The John Basilone who'd climbed onto Lunga Ridge on October 23rd was dead. He'd died somewhere between the first burst of machine gun fire and the last, had been burned away as surely as the skin on his palms. What was left was something else, something harder, something that knew too much about what men could do to each other, about what he could do, about the terrible mathematics of survival. They finished the surgery at 0830 hours. By 0900, word had spread through the American positions. Sergeant Basilone had held, had made 2 runs through Japanese-controlled jungle for ammunition, had fired over 12,000 rounds, had saved the entire section of line. The story grew with each retelling, as all war stories do. Some versions had him fighting hand-to-hand with a dozen Japanese soldiers. Others claimed he'd killed 1,500 enemy troops single-handedly. The numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the story itself, the narrative of one man refusing to break, refusing to surrender, refusing to accept defeat. In December of 1942, with the war going badly in Europe and the Pacific both, America desperately needed heroes. Needed proof that courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. John Basilone, whether he wanted it or not, became that proof. The medal and the myth. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor came through channels with unusual speed. Normally, such awards took months of verification, review boards, and bureaucratic processing. Basilone's came through in 3 weeks. On Christmas Eve 1942, Major General Alexander Vandegrift pinned the light blue ribbon and bronze star on Sergeant Basilone's chest in a ceremony at the division headquarters. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy Japanese forces, above and beyond the call of duty, while serving with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division in the Lunga area, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, on October 24th and 25th, 1942. While the enemy was hammering at the Marines' defensive positions, Sergeant Basilone, in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns, fought valiantly to check the savage and determined assault. In a fierce frontal attack with the Japanese blasting his guns with grenades and mortar fire, one of Sergeant Basilone's sections with its gun crews was put out of action, leaving only 2 men able to carry on. Moving an extra gun into position, he placed it in action, then, under continual fire, repaired another and personally manned it, gallantly holding his defensive position. Sergeant Basilone, in a forceful and determined attack, killed at least 38 of the enemy. With ammunition for the machine guns critically low, he fought his way through hostile lines, carrying ammo to the guns. Later that night, with one of his sections surrounded by the Japanese and disengaged, he brought his gun to a new position, and with the remaining section fought off the Japanese attack. With automatic weapon fire pouring in all around him, he gallantly continued to fire his gun himself, until the enemy attack was ended. Sergeant Basilone's valor and complete devotion to duty reflected great credit upon himself and the United States Naval Service. The official count was 38 Japanese soldiers killed. The actual number was closer to 300, but the military in its wisdom understood that some truths were too large for public consumption, that transforming Sergeant Basilone into a symbol required making him comprehensible, translating the incomprehensible reality of industrial-scale killing into something Americans could digest over their morning coffee. Basilone stood at attention while photographers captured the moment. His hands were wrapped in white bandages that made him look like he was wearing boxing gloves. The burns were healing slowly, but the doctors said he'd never regain full sensation in his fingers. Nerve damage was permanent. He would spend the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be, with hands that didn't quite work the way hands should. The other Marines cheered. General Vandegrift shook his hand, carefully aware of the injuries, and said something about duty and honor that Basilone didn't really hear. His mind was elsewhere, back on Lunga Ridge, back in the moment when the ammunition ran out, and he'd made the decision that everything afterward flowed from If he'd stayed at his position, waited for someone else to make the run, would he be standing here now? Would the line have held? Would Private Di Fiore still be alive? Because Di Fiore, wonderful Di Fiore, who talked about marrying Rosa, had been killed in a mortar attack 2 weeks after the battle, and Basilone hadn't been there to save him. These were the questions that occupied the Medal of Honor recipient's mind, while cameras flashed and officers congratulated him. These were the thoughts he couldn't share, couldn't articulate, couldn't even fully acknowledge to himself. In January of 1943, the Marine Corps made another decision. Sergeant Basilone was going home, not for rest, not for recovery, for war bonds. The United States was spending approximately $250 million per day on the war effort. That money came from bonds, essentially loans from American citizens to their government, backed by nothing more than faith that the war would be won and the debt repaid. Bond drives were crucial to financing the conflict, and nothing sold bonds like a genuine hero with a Medal of Honor and a compelling story. Basilone received his orders with the same stoic acceptance he'd shown for every other order in his military career. He didn't want to go, wanted to stay with his battalion, with the men who understood what he'd been through, because they'd been through it too. But the Marine Corps didn't ask what he wanted. They told him he was needed at home, that selling bonds was just as important as fighting, that he could serve his country better as a symbol than as a machine gunner. It was probably true. It was also, from Basilone's perspective, a kind of death. He arrived in San Diego on February 7, 1943, to a hero's welcome that felt like an assault. Thousands of people lined the streets. Bands played. Women threw flowers. Children held signs. Welcome home. Manila John. The nickname had followed him from the Philippines, where he'd served before the war, and the press loved it. Exotic, memorable, perfect for headlines. Basilone stood in an open car, waving with his bandaged hands, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The crowd saw what they wanted to see. A hero, modest and brave, embodying American values. What they didn't see was a man drowning in a sea of misunderstanding, surrounded by people who thought they knew him, but knew only the sanitized story. The War Bond tour lasted 8 months, 8 months of train travel from city to city: New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, Los Angeles. 8 months of giving the same speech, with minor variations, about courage and duty and the American fighting man. 8 months of meeting politicians who wanted to shake his hand, businessmen who wanted to be photographed with him, young men who wanted to hear about killing Japanese soldiers in graphic detail. He was asked to demonstrate how he'd fired the machine gun from the hip, asked to reenact the ammunition runs, asked what it felt like to kill so many enemy troops. The questions came with breathless enthusiasm, as if war were a sporting event and he'd just had an exceptional game. Basilone answered patiently. He'd been trained to follow orders, and this was his order: be a hero for the folks back home. So he smiled and spoke and signed autographs, and never once told the truth about what it felt like to watch a man's face disappear in a burst of machine gun fire, or how the smell of burning flesh stayed with you long after the battle ended, or how he sometimes woke up at 3 in the morning with his hands locked in the shape of gripping a gun that wasn't there. The money rolled in. Over $1 million in bond sales attributed directly to his appearances. The Marine Corps was ecstatic. The Treasury Department gave him a medal. Basilone collected accolades like some men collected stamps, each one adding to the weight of expectations. In June of 1943, he went home to Raritan. The town threw a parade. 7,000 people, more than twice Raritan's actual population, with folks coming from neighboring communities to see the local boy made good. They'd erected a banner across Main Street. "Welcome home, Sergeant Basilone, our hero." His mother cried. His father, Giovanni, who'd never shown much emotion about anything, gripped his son's shoulders and couldn't speak. The mayor gave a speech about how Raritan had always known John was special, how the town was proud, how he embodied the best of American courage. It was a nice speech. It was also a lie. Raritan hadn't known John was special. Raritan had known him as one of 9 kids from a poor family, a decent boxer, a guy who worked construction because there weren't a lot of other options. The town had paid him exactly as much attention as it paid any young man, which was to say, very little. But the myth required a different narrative. It required that Basilone had always been destined for greatness, that his heroism was somehow inevitable, written into his character from birth. So that's the story they told, and Basilone stood on the reviewing platform and listened to them rewrite his past to match his present. He spent 2 weeks in Raritan, slept in his childhood bed, sat at the dinner table with his siblings, who treated him with a careful reverence that felt like a wall. His mother kept cooking his favorite foods, pasta fazool, braciole, cannoli from the Italian bakery, as if love could be expressed only through feeding him. Maybe it could. Maybe that was the only language she had for what she felt, which was relief and pride, and a terror she couldn't name that her son had come back from war, but hadn't really come home. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Basilone would sit on the back porch and smoke. He'd taken up cigarettes on Guadalcanal. Everyone did, because what the hell else were you going to do with your hands during the long hours between combat? And now he found he couldn't stop. The ritual of lighting up, the burn in his lungs, the slow exhale into darkness. It was one of the few things that felt real. His father found him there one night, around 2 a.m. "Can't sleep?" Giovanni asked in Italian. They still spoke Italian at home, the language of Basilone's childhood, though John was more comfortable in English now. "Don't really try any more," Basilone answered in the same language. Giovanni nodded, like this made perfect sense. He sat down in the other porch chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He'd aged in the years John had been gone. More gray in his hair, more lines around his eyes. Or maybe he'd always looked like this, and John had just never noticed. "You want to talk about it?" Giovanni asked. "No." "Good, because I don't want to hear about it." Giovanni pulled out his own cigarettes, he'd smoked since before John was born, and lit up. They sat in companionable silence, 2 men who understood that sometimes the deepest conversations are the ones without words. Finally, Giovanni said, "Your mother, she thinks you're going to stay. Take a job at the factory, maybe. Settle down. Find a nice girl. And you? I think you're already gone. Just haven't left yet." Basilone took a long drag on his cigarette, held the smoke, let it out slowly. "They want me to stay stateside. Train recruits, maybe. Make more appearances for the bond drives. The Corps says I've done enough, that I've earned the right to sit out the rest of the war. But you won't." "No." Giovanni nodded again. "You know, when I came to America, I thought I was leaving the old world behind. All that violence, all that pain from the old country. Thought America was different, better. Maybe it is. But I think maybe men are the same everywhere. Some of us, we have violence in us. Not because we're bad, but because it's just there. And once you've let it out, once you've seen what you're capable of." He trailed off, looking at the dark shapes of houses on the street. "You can't put it back. Can't pretend you don't know." "I held the line, Papa. That's all. I did my job. Your job was to kill hundreds of men. My job was to keep my position, to protect the Marines to my left and right. To John." Giovanni's voice was gentle but firm. Don't make speeches to your father. I see what happened to your hands. I see how you wake up at night. I see how you look at all these people treating you like you're something special, and how it makes you feel worse, not better." He stubbed out his cigarette. "You think I don't understand. But I understand more than you know. The violence, it marks you, changes you. And then you have to decide. Do you run from what you are, or do you go back and finish it? What did you do?" Basilone had never asked his father about the old country, about what Giovanni had left behind in Italy. "I ran. Came here, opened a tailor shop, tried to be peaceful." Giovanni stood up, his joints popping. "Some days, I think I made the right choice. Other days," he shrugged, You'll make your own choice. But whatever you decide, know that your mother and I will understand, even if we don't understand." He went back inside, leaving Basilone alone with his cigarette and his thoughts. Returned to the war in July of 1943, Sergeant John Basilone formally requested return to combat duty. The Marine Corps tried to talk him out of it. He was worth more at home, they said. His hands hadn't fully healed. He could train recruits, could continue with the bond drives, could serve honorably without risking his life again. Besides, how many times could one man be expected to cheat death? Basilone was insistent. The recruiting depot at Camp Pendleton could use an experienced NCO, they countered. The War Department needed heroes for publicity purposes. Congress was considering a special assignment that would keep him in Washington, advising on military appropriations. "I'm not a politician," Basilone told them. "I'm not a symbol. I'm a Marine. And Marines belong with their units." There was another reason, one he didn't articulate in official channels, but that everyone who knew him understood. He couldn't live with himself if he sat out the war while men he'd trained, men he'd fought beside, continued to die. The guilt would destroy him more surely than any Japanese bullet. The Corps relented in December of 1943, but with conditions. He wouldn't return to the 1st Marine Division, too much risk of losing their most famous Medal of Honor recipient. Instead, he'd be assigned to the 5th Marine Division, a new unit training for the next major amphibious assault. He'd have a leadership role, minimal frontline exposure. Basilone accepted, knowing it was a lie, knowing that when the shooting started, no role was minimal, no position was safe, but accepting anyway, because going back was the only way forward. At Camp Pendleton, he met Lena May Riggy. She was a Marine herself, one of the 27,000 women who joined the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, serving in non-combat roles to free up men for fighting. Sergeant Riggy worked in the motor pool as a mechanic, and she was good at it, could tear down an engine and rebuild it faster than most men twice her size. They met at a USO dance in February of 1944. Basilone had been dragged there by other Marines who thought he needed to relax, to have fun, to act like a normal human being for once. He'd been standing in the corner, nursing a beer, and wishing he was anywhere else, when Lena walked up to him. "You're Manila John," she said. "Not a question. Just John is fine. I'm Lena. And I don't care about your medal." Basilone looked at her, really looked. She was pretty in a way that wasn't obvious, with dark hair pulled back in regulation style and grease under her fingernails from working on engines. But what caught his attention was her directness, the way she held his gaze without fawning, without asking for stories, without treating him like he was made of glass. "Why'd you come over here then?" he asked. "Because you look like someone who doesn't want to be here, and I figured we could be miserable together instead of separately." She took his beer, sipped it, made a face. "This is warm. Come on, let's get a fresh one." They talked for 3 hours. About Raritan and Portland, Oregon, where Lena had grown up. About working-class families and the Depression and what it meant to join the Marines when you didn't have any other good options. About engines and machine guns and the satisfaction of maintaining equipment that did exactly what it was supposed to do. About everything except Guadalcanal. Lena didn't ask about the battle, didn't ask about killing or fear or what it felt like to be a hero. She asked about his family, about whether he missed Italian food, about whether he thought the Dodgers had a chance at the pennant. Normal questions, human questions. For the first time since coming home, Basilone felt like himself. They started seeing each other regularly. Nothing flashy. Dinner at the base commissary, walks along the beach, quiet evenings where they didn't need to fill the silence with conversation. Lena had her own demons. She'd lost a brother at Tarawa, and she wore his dog tags along with her own. She understood, in a way that civilians couldn't, what it meant to live in the shadow of violence. In June of 1944, Basilone asked her to marry him. They were sitting on the beach at sunset, watching the Pacific turn gold and orange, when he said, "I'm shipping out soon, probably in a few months, and I might not come back. I know, Lena said, but if I do come back, when I do come back, I'd like you to be waiting, as my wife, if you'll have me. Lena was quiet for a long time, long enough that Basilone started to think he'd miscalculated, that he'd mistaken friendship for something deeper. Then she said, I'll marry you on one condition. What's that? You don't make me any promises about coming back. Don't tell me you'll be careful or that you'll try to survive, or any of that. Just promise me that when you're over there, you'll do what you need to do. And I'll do the same here. That's it? That's it. She looked at him with those steady eyes that had attracted him in the first place. I don't want a husband who's half here and half somewhere else, spending all his energy worrying about what I'm feeling. I want you all the way present, wherever you are, even if where you are gets you killed. That's the strangest marriage proposal I've ever heard, Basilone said. It's the only one you're going to get from me. They were married on July 27, 1944, at St. Mary's Star of the Sea Church in Oceanside, California. The ceremony was small. A few Marines from Basilone's unit, some of Lena's friends from the motor pool, both their families. No press, no publicity. Just two people making promises they weren't sure they could keep. The reception was at the enlisted club on base. Someone had smuggled in real champagne, not easy in wartime, and everyone got pleasantly drunk while a radio played big band music. Basilone danced with his wife, his scarred hands resting on her waist, and for a few hours he let himself believe that maybe there was a future beyond the war, beyond the violence, beyond the machine guns. They had 10 days together before his unit shipped out. 10 days of being married, of learning each other's rhythms, of trying to compress a lifetime of intimacy into a handful of sunrises. They didn't talk about Iwo Jima, though both of them knew that was where the 5th Marine Division was headed. Didn't talk about the possibility that these might be the only 10 days they ever had. They just lived them as fully and completely as they could, and hoped it would be enough to sustain them through whatever came next. On the last night, lying in bed in the cheap motel room they'd rented off base, Lena said, Tell me one thing, just one thing about Guadalcanal. Something real. Basilone thought about it, thought about all the things he could say, about the fear, the exhaustion, the way it felt to watch men die, the transformation from human to weapon. Finally, he said, the gun kept firing. That's all. Everything else failed. The cooling jacket, my hands, the ammunition supply. But the gun kept firing. And sometimes I think that's all any of us can do. Just keep firing until either we win or we can't fire anymore. Lena nodded in the darkness. Okay, I understand. And maybe she did. Maybe in that moment, lying together in the dark with the Pacific wind rattling the windows, they achieved something like complete understanding. Or maybe they just pretended because pretending was all anyone could do in wartime, and sometimes pretending was enough. Iwo Jima. The 5th Marine Division landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, at 0900 hours. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, he'd been promoted in recognition of his previous service, was with Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 27th Marines. His position, machine gun section leader, responsible for coordinating the heavy weapons support for his company's advance. On paper, it was a leadership role that should have kept him behind the initial assault wave. In practice, Basilone was among the first men off the landing craft, because leadership meant leading, and leading meant going first. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock, ash, and entrenched Japanese defenders. The island's only strategic value was its airfields, close enough to mainland Japan that American B-29s could use them as emergency landing strips. But that modest value had been purchased with over 20,000 Japanese soldiers dug into caves, bunkers, and fortifications that had been years in the making. They'd prepared for this battle with meticulous care, understanding that Iwo Jima couldn't be held, but could be made so expensive to take that the Americans might hesitate before invading the home islands. The beach was black. Volcanic ash, fine as powder, that made every step a struggle. Landing craft struggled to gain purchase. tanks bogged down, and from the high ground, from Mount Suribachi at the island's southern tip and the ridges running north, Japanese artillery and mortars began to rain down with brutal precision. Basilone's landing craft hit the beach at 0905. The ramp dropped and Charlie Company poured out into hell. The noise was indescribable. Not just gunfire, but the scream of incoming artillery, the crump of mortars hitting the ash, the roar of naval gunfire from the ships offshore trying to suppress Japanese positions. Men fell before they'd taken 10 steps. The ash flew up in black plumes with each explosion, creating a fog of war that was literal, choking, blinding. Basilone organized his machine gun teams without hesitation. They'd drilled for this, practiced beach landings dozens of times at Camp Pendleton. But practice had been on California sand, not volcanic ash. The tripods for the machine guns wouldn't anchor properly. The ash got into the mechanisms, into the ammunition feeds, into everything. "Get those guns up to the first terrace," Basilone shouted over the noise. "We need covering fire." The first terrace was a shelf of rock about 30 yards inland, where the beach rose sharply. If they could get machine guns positioned there, they could suppress some of the Japanese fire coming from the high ground. If. The 30 yards might as well have been 30 miles. Basilone grabbed one of the Brownings, not carrying it himself this time, but directing its crew, a corporal named Paul Skowronski and a private named Dominic Galante. They made it 15 yards before a mortar round landed close enough to knock all 3 of them down. Basilone was up first, checking his men, checking the gun. Skowronski had shrapnel in his leg. Galante was shaken, but okay. The gun was fine. "Leave me," Skowronski said through gritted teeth. "Get the gun in position." It was Guadalcanal all over again, the same impossible calculus. One man's injury versus the mission's success. Basilone made the same choice he'd made before. "Galante, help me with the gun. Corpsman." He waved to a Navy medic who was working on a wounded Marine nearby. "Wounded man here." They moved forward. Basilone and Galante carrying the Browning, the tripod, the ammunition. Other Marines from Charlie Company were doing the same, trying to establish a foothold, trying to get off the killing ground of the beach. Japanese machine gun fire from concealed positions created zones where nothing could live, where crossing meant death. But they had to cross, had to keep moving. Stopping meant dying just as surely as advancing, but at least advancing offered the chance of accomplishing something. They reached the first terrace at 0930. Set up the gun, started firing at the Japanese positions on the high ground. It was exactly like Guadalcanal, the mechanical rhythm of controlled bursts, the traversing fire, the discipline of ammunition conservation. Basilone had done this 1,000 times. His hands, scarred and imperfectly healed, knew what to do. But Iwo Jima was different. The Japanese weren't coming in waves. They were dug in, waiting, using the terrain and their fortifications to inflict maximum casualties while preserving their own forces. The battle wouldn't be won with machine guns holding a defensive line. It would be won with tanks and flamethrowers and Marines willing to crawl up to bunker entrances and throw in grenades. Gunny. A Lieutenant Basilone didn't know well. Powell from Baker Company came running in a crouch. "We've got a pillbox 30 yards up, right side. It's got our advance pinned down. Can you suppress it?" Basilone looked where Powell was pointing. The pillbox was a concrete emplacement with a narrow firing slit, perfectly positioned to enfilade the Marine advance. Machine gun fire from the Browning would rattle off the concrete, accomplish nothing. "I need to get closer," Basilone said. "Demo charge or flamethrower. We don't have either in this sector yet. Tanks are still on the beach trying to get through the ash. Then we go without." Basilone turned to Galante. "Keep this gun firing. I need to flank that position." "Gunny, that's suicide. There's no cover, which is why you need to keep their heads down." Basilone moved before he could think too much about it. Thinking was the enemy. Thinking let you understand the odds, let you calculate the near certainty of death, let you become paralyzed by reasonable fear. So he didn't think, just moved, low and fast, using every fold in the ground, every slight depression, anything that might provide an extra inch of cover. Japanese fire tracked him. He felt rounds passing close enough to hear, that distinctive crack of supersonic bullets displacing air. The ash exploded around his boots. He rolled into a shell crater, caught his breath, moved again. 20 yards. 15. 10. Close enough now to see the pillbox clearly. Close enough to see the barrel of the Japanese machine gun traversing, searching for him. Close enough to pull a grenade from his belt, arm it, and throw. The grenade went through the firing slit. Not impossible, but improbable, threading that narrow opening from 10 yards while under fire. But Basilone had spent his youth throwing punches in boxing rings, had developed the kind of hand-eye coordination that separated competent from excellent. The grenade disappeared into the pillbox, and 3 seconds later, the muffled crump of the explosion inside. The Japanese machine gun went silent. Basilone didn't celebrate, didn't acknowledge the small triumph, just moved back toward his own lines, toward where Galante was still firing the Browning, providing the covering fire that had kept Basilone alive. This was how it went. Small actions, repeated hundreds of times across the beach, each one inconsequential by itself, but collectively determining whether the landing succeeded or failed. By 1100 hours, Charlie Company had established positions on the first terrace. The cost had been severe. 23 men killed, 47 wounded, out of a company that had landed with 215. But they'd gained the foothold. The beach was still a chaos of landing craft, wounded Marines, and destroyed equipment. But the perimeter was expanding, meter by bloody meter. Basilone moved among his machine gun crews, checking their positions, ensuring they had ammunition, coordinating their fire. This was the job of a gunnery sergeant. Not glory, not heroics, but the grinding work of leadership. Making sure the guns were maintained, making sure the men rotated through firing positions so no one got too exhausted, making sure the water in the cooling jackets was changed before it boiled away. At 1300 hours, the order came down. Advance toward the second terrace. The second terrace was another 100 yards inland, across ground that provided even less cover than the beach. Japanese artillery had the range zeroed in. Every Marine who'd survived the landing knew what the next phase would cost. But they went anyway. Because the mission required it. Because stopping meant letting the men behind them die on the beach. Because refusing wasn't an option. And living with yourself after refusing would be worse than dying trying. Basilone led one of the machine gun teams forward. They moved in short rushes. 10 yards, hit the deck. 10 more yards, hit the deck. The ash made it hard to see, hard to breathe. Explosions created craters that filled with Marines taking cover, then filled with more explosions. The dead and wounded became obstacles to navigate around, and there was no time to help. No time to grieve, only time to keep moving. They were halfway to the second terrace when the mortar round hit. Not a direct hit. If it had been direct, there would have been nothing left to write about. But close enough. Close enough that the concussion lifted Basilone off his feet and slammed him down into the ash. Close enough that shrapnel tore through his left side, through his leg, through the meat of his shoulder. Close enough that for a moment he couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched ringing. Couldn't see anything except black spots dancing in his vision. He lay there, trying to understand what had happened. Trying to inventory his body. What worked? His right arm. Yes, his right leg, mostly. His left side. Something wrong there, something wet and hot spreading across his uniform. His head, ringing, disoriented, but functional. Someone was shouting his name. Galante, still alive, crawling toward him through the ash. Gunny! Gunny, can you hear me? Basilone tried to answer, managed only a cough that brought up blood. Not good. Blood in the lungs meant serious internal damage. He'd seen enough wounded men to know what that meant. Corpsman! Galante was screaming now, desperate. Corpsman! We need a corpsman. But the corpsmen were overwhelmed, were working on men who were worse off, or were dead themselves. Iwo Jima was eating medics faster than any battle in the Pacific. The Japanese had learned to target them specifically, knowing that killing corpsmen demoralized entire units. Basilone grabbed Galante's arm, pulled him close. The gun, he said, or tried to say. It came out as a whisper, barely audible over the battle sounds. "Forget the gun. You're hit bad, Gunny. We need to get you back to the beach, get you evacuated." "The gun," Basilone repeated, because the gun was what mattered. Not his life, not his pain, but the gun, the mission, the advance. Everything he'd learned at Guadalcanal, everything he'd become, reduced to this simple truth. The gun had to keep firing. Galante understood, or pretended to understand. He nodded, squeezed Basilone's hand, then crawled back to the Browning and resumed firing. Basilone closed his eyes. The ash was soft, almost comfortable. The pain from his wounds was distant, growing more distant. His body was shutting down, doing what bodies do when they're too damaged to repair. He thought about Lena. Hoped she'd understand. Hoped she'd find someone else, someone who could give her the life he never could. Hoped, "I've got you, Marine." Basilone opened his eyes. A corpsman, couldn't have been more than 20 years old, his uniform soaked with other men's blood, was kneeling beside him, opening his medical kit. "You're going to be fine," the corpsman said with the kind of confident lie that corpsmen specialized in. "Just a little shrapnel. We'll get you patched up." But then the corpsman cut away Basilone's uniform and saw the wounds, saw the blood, the torn flesh, the depth of the damage. His expression changed, just for a moment, just a flicker, and Basilone saw the truth there. "How bad?" Basilone asked. The corpsman didn't answer immediately, was busy jamming gauze into the worst of the wounds, applying pressure, doing everything he'd been trained to do. Finally, "Bad enough that you're getting evac'd. No arguments. Can you save me?" The corpsman looked at him. Really looked. "If we get you to the hospital ship in the next 30 minutes? "Yeah, I can save you." "Then let's go." They brought up a stretcher. 2 Marines from Charlie Company, Basilone didn't know their names, had never seen them before, carried him back across the beach toward the water, toward the landing craft that were ferrying wounded out to the hospital ships. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body. He gritted his teeth, didn't scream, didn't give the Japanese the satisfaction of knowing they'd broken him. The landing craft ride was eternal. 5 minutes that felt like hours, bouncing across the waves while the corpsman kept pressure on the wounds, kept telling Basilone to stay with him, stay conscious, stay alive. They reached the hospital ship at 1400 hours. USS Samaritan, converted from a luxury liner into a floating surgical ward. Basilone was carried aboard on the stretcher, down corridors painted white, into a surgical suite where doctors in blood-stained aprons worked on an assembly line of wounded Marines. A surgeon looked at him, looked at the corpsman's preliminary assessment, and made a decision. "Get him prepped. We're operating now." "Now?" The corpsman sounded surprised. "Now? This man's a Medal of Honor recipient. We're not letting him die in triage." And there it was. The same dynamic that had played out on Guadalcanal, where Dr. Sorensen had violated protocols to operate on Basilone immediately. The recognition that heroism created obligations, that some lives carried weight beyond their individual existence. It wasn't fair. It wasn't democratic. But it was true. They put him under, with ether. The last thing Basilone saw before unconsciousness was the overhead light, brilliant white, clean, so different from the black ash of Iwo Jima. The last thing he thought was, "I'm going to live. Against all odds, all probability, I'm going to live. What comes after?" The surgery took 4 hours. They removed shrapnel from his left lung, repaired damage to his intestines, closed the wounds in his leg and shoulder. The surgeon, a Navy captain named Marcus Chen, who'd trained at Johns Hopkins before the war, told Basilone later that he'd been 90 seconds from bleeding out when he'd reached the operating table. 90 seconds between life and death. The corpsman's estimate had been almost exactly right, 30 minutes from battlefield to surgery, with no margin for error. Basilone spent 6 weeks recovering aboard the Samaritan, long enough to see the battle reports, to learn that Iwo Jima had been secured after 36 days of fighting, long enough to learn that Charlie Company had lost 62% of its men, long enough to learn that Private Galante had been killed the same day Basilone was wounded, shot through the head while manning the Browning. Long enough to understand that he was alive because protocols had been violated, because his fame had earned him priority treatment, because he'd received care that better men, younger men, men with families waiting, men who'd shown just as much courage, had been denied. The guilt was crushing. In April of 1945, he was transferred stateside to Mare Island Naval Hospital in California, where he underwent additional surgeries to repair nerve damage in his leg. The doctors said he'd walk again, but with a limp. Said he'd never return to combat. Said he'd probably receive a medical discharge with full disability benefits and a lifetime of gratitude from a nation he'd served twice. Lena visited him every day. She'd requested a transfer to Mare Island, and the Marine Corps, understanding good publicity when they saw it, had approved. She sat beside his bed, held his scarred hands, and didn't ask questions about what had happened or how he was feeling. Just sat there, present, solid, real. One afternoon in May, victory in Europe had been declared. Japan was on the verge of collapse. The war that had defined their generation was ending. Basilone said, "I shouldn't have survived." Again. "But you did," Lena said simply. "Galante died at the gun. While I was getting carried to the hospital ship, he died. Di Fiore died on Guadalcanal. And I keep living. What kind of mathematics is that? The unfair kind. How do I live with it?" Lena was quiet for a long time. Then, "The same way you lived with everything else. One day at a time. 1 hour at a time if you have to. You keep the gun firing like you told me. That's all any of us can do, but what if—" "Stop." Her voice was firm. "Stop thinking about what if. You made it. You're here. And we're going to figure out what comes next. Together." What came next was complicated. The war ended in August with Japan's surrender. The 5th Marine Division was deactivated. The men who'd survived Iwo Jima, and there weren't as many as there should have been, went home to parades and celebrations, and a country that wanted to forget about war as quickly as possible. Basilone received another medal, the Navy Cross, for his actions on Iwo Jima. It was presented at a ceremony at Camp Pendleton with photographers and newsreels and all the pageantry that made him deeply uncomfortable. The citation praised his courage, his leadership, his sacrifice. It didn't mention the protocol violations that had saved his life, or the men who died while he lived, or the survivor's guilt that was eating him from the inside. He stayed in the Marine Corps, partly because the military was the only life he knew, partly because leaving felt like abandoning something unfinished. They gave him desk jobs, training positions, administrative roles, safe assignments designed to protect their most famous sergeant. He accepted them because refusing would have been pointless. But part of him, the part that had come alive on Lunga Ridge and refused to die even on Iwo Jima, chafed at the safety. In 1948, he and Lena had a daughter. They named her Joan, after Basilone's mother. She was healthy, loud, perfect. Basilone held her in his scarred hands and felt something he hadn't felt since before the war: hope. Hope that maybe there was a purpose to survival beyond guilt. Hope that maybe the future could be different from the past. He left the Marines in 1952, after 11 years of service, took his discharge papers and his medals, and moved back to New Jersey with Lena and Joan. Got a job as a construction supervisor, working on the highway projects that were remaking post-war America. It wasn't what anyone expected from a Medal of Honor recipient. People kept asking when he was going to write his memoirs, go into politics, cash in on his fame. He never did. Writing about what he'd experienced felt like exploitation, and politics felt like selling something he didn't believe in. He just worked construction, came home to his wife and daughter, tried to be a regular man, living a regular life. But the past didn't let go easily. The nightmares continued. Not every night, but often enough. He'd wake up in darkness, hearing the sound of the Browning, feeling the heat of the barrel, seeing the faces of men dying. Lena learned to recognize the signs, learned to wake him gently, learned to sit with him in the kitchen at 3 in the morning while he smoked and didn't talk about what he'd dreamed. On the 30th anniversary of the Guadalcanal battle, October 1972, the Marine Corps held a ceremony, invited all surviving veterans of the campaign, including Basilone. He didn't want to go. Hadn't maintained contact with many Marines from his old unit, but Lena convinced him, saying it might provide some kind of closure. The ceremony was at the Marine Corps Museum in Washington, speeches about duty and sacrifice, a memorial wall with the names of Marines who died in the Solomon Islands. Basilone stood in front of that wall, reading names, recognizing some, De Fiore, Powers, De Groot, and realizing most were strangers. Men who'd died on the same island, in the same campaign, but whose stories he'd never heard. An old man approached him, thin, leaning on a cane, but Basilone recognized him immediately. Paul Skowronski, the corporal who'd been wounded on Iwo Jima while helping carry the machine gun. Gunny Basilone. Just John now. Haven't been in the Corps for 20 years. Once a Marine, always a Marine. Skowronski extended his hand, and they shook, two old men with scarred palms from carrying hot weapons. I wanted to thank you. You saved my life that day on the beach. Got me to a corpsman when you could have kept moving. I didn't save you. The corpsman did. You made sure the corpsman knew I was there. In that chaos, that mattered. Skowronski leaned on his cane, looked at the memorial wall. I read about you over the years. Heard you got out, lived a quiet life. Good for you. A lot of us never figured out how to do that. I'm not sure I did either. But you're still here. That counts for something. Maybe it did. Standing in the museum, surrounded by veterans who'd survived their own versions of hell, Basilone felt something shift. Not healing. There are some wounds that never heal. But acceptance. He was alive. Men he'd fought beside were dead. There was no fair mathematics to explain it, no cosmic justice, no reason beyond random chance and protocol violations. But he was alive, and maybe the best he could do was honor that accident of survival by living as well as he could. He and Lena left the ceremony early, drove back to their hotel. That night, for the first time in 30 years, Basilone told her the complete story of Guadalcanal. Not the sanitized version he'd given in speeches, but the truth, the fear, the transformation, the moment when he'd stopped being human and become the gun, the numbness that had followed, the guilt that had never left. Lena listened without interruption. When he finished, she said, "Thank you for telling me. That's it? No judgment? No horror? What would be the point? You did what you had to do, and you've been living with it ever since. That's enough punishment for any man. But is it? Do I deserve—" John. She took his face in her hands, forced him to look at her. Life isn't about what we deserve. It's about what we do with what we get. You got survival, twice against impossible odds. So do something with it. Be a good father. Be a good husband. Be a good man. That's how you honor the ones who didn't make it. Epilogue. The weight of living gunnery, Sergeant John Basilone died in 1983 at age 66. The official cause was heart failure, but really it was just time. His body, which had survived machine gun positions and mortar rounds and surgeries that should have killed him, finally gave out. They buried him with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, the 21st Gun Salute, the folding of the flag. A Marine honor guard that moved with the precision that Basilone had once embodied. Hundreds of people attended. Marines from his old units, politicians who'd never met him but needed to be seen honoring a hero, and regular people who remembered the name from history books. Lena, white-haired and steady, accepted the folded flag. Joan stood beside her mother, crying quietly. The priest said words about sacrifice and duty and eternal rest. All the usual words that get said when burying a man who'd done exceptional things in terrible times. But what no one mentioned, what couldn't be mentioned in a public ceremony, was the private cost. the decades of nightmares, the survivor's guilt that never quite faded, the complicated relationship with heroism, where the thing that made you famous was also the thing that marked you forever. The struggle to be a regular husband and father when part of you was still on Lunga Ridge, hands wrapped around a machine gun, firing into darkness. John Basilone had held the line, had run through enemy territory for ammunition, had killed hundreds, had survived what should have killed him twice. He'd been given medals, been made into a symbol, been asked to represent something larger than himself. And then he'd done the hardest thing of all. He'd lived with it, lived with the memory of Di Fiore talking about marrying Rosa, lived with the knowledge that protocol violations had saved him while better men died, lived with the transformation from human to weapon and the long, painful journey back toward humanity, lived with being celebrated for things that haunted him. There are different kinds of courage: the courage to run into machine gun fire, the courage to hold a defensive position against impossible odds, and the courage to keep living day after day, year after year, carrying weight that no one else can see. John Basilone demonstrated all three. The first two made him famous. The third made him a man. In the end, that's what his story is really about. Not the heroism of a single night, but the heroism of all the nights that followed. The choice to keep firing the gun, metaphorically speaking, even when the barrel was hot and the ammunition was low and every instinct screamed to stop. The choice to honor survival by living fully, not perfectly, but with as much grace and purpose as scarred hands could manage. The Marine Corps remembers him as a warrior. His family remembers him as a husband and father. History remembers him as a Medal of Honor recipient. But maybe the truest memorial is simpler. John Basilone was a man who did impossible things and then had to figure out how to be ordinary. And in that struggle, that long, unglamorous, deeply human struggle, he found a different kind of victory. Not the kind that gets engraved on monuments. The kind that happens in quiet moments. A daughter learning to walk while her father watches, scarred hands ready to catch her. A wife holding her husband during a nightmare, providing an anchor back to reality. A construction supervisor making sure his crew gets home safe because he knows too much about what it means when they don't. The gun kept firing in its way, just differently, just enough. And in the end, that was enough.